Hi, I'm Sophie.
And I'm Izzy.
Today, we will be discussing and answering the question of how climate change affects migration in the Pacific Island region.
Through our research, we have found that the pace of climate change has rapidly excelled and continues to gain speed.
Currently, most Pacific Island countries' populations are either growing or plateauing. In the future, this will not be the case, and the populations will sharply decrease.
The Pacific Islands are located in the Oceania region and are bordered by the Pacific Ocean.
This region encompasses approximately 25,000 islands, all of which are at risk due to rising sea levels caused by climate change. Many inhabitants of these islands do not want to be seen as refugees, but rather they would prefer to relocate as a group or a tribe. In their words, we want to be seen as active economic and social contributors to any country to which we might need to move. People in the Pacific Islands love their home and their culture. Most people surveyed would be very opposed to moving. In American territories of the Pacific Islands, the population and TFR has taken a sharp decline from 2010 to 2020. American Samoa's population has dropped to about 50,000 from 55,000 previously. Guam's population has decreased by 3.5%. Experts speculate that the population has dropped considerably over the past 2 years due to COVID-19. The reason for Samoa's declining population is actually due to outward migration. Many people are opposed to having more children because they do not want them to grow up in a world of devastating climate change, especially in American Samoa. On the outermost parts of the island, the rising sea level has contributed to inward migration. The reason for leaving American Samoa vary from person to person, but most people relocate to either Australia or California. One major issue in American Samoa and other Pacific Islands is the lack of economic opportunities, and these opportunities are growing slimmer and slimmer. Coral reefs throughout American Samoa are being destroyed by bleaching. Bleaching can be caused by heat exposure, polluted oceans, and just overall climate change. Without these coral reefs, Samoa has struggled to draw more tourists, resulting in tough economic times. This is one reason for the mass exodus of Samoans. In 2015, Vanuatu was hit by Cyclone Pam. This particular cyclone was terribly destructive and caused the country to lose 64% of its GDP. Over the past 20 years, cyclones and most weather have become increasingly worse. The population of Vanuatu is no stranger to cyclones, but they have progressed to be unruly. This country only contributes 0.0016% of global emissions, yet they unjustly struggle with climate change.
In a report published by the UNFCCC database, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which uses data from surveyed families inhabiting the Pacific Islands, this data explained that over a third of Neuron households believe that migration will be necessary in the future due to climate change. However, only 53% of the people perceive that they would be able to afford migration in the future. The article also further explains the benefits of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and how it will provide support for those who will eventually be driven out of their homelands and forced to migrate due to climate change.
This picture shows a crowd of people gathered outside their church after a high tide swept through Tuvalu, causing a flood. Not only is climate change affecting Pacific Islanders' land, but also their health. An indirect effect of climate change has caused an increase in disease-carrying bugs. Due to these high tides, local plants have been swept away, causing the island's population to rely on dense and high-calorie junk foods. With a combination of little exercise and unhealthy diets, many diseases such as obesity and diabetes plague the population.
As shown through this development of photos, many islands in this region have lost landmass due to rising sea levels, which are a direct result of climate change. This progression shows the loss of land on Sagamo Island, located within the Solomon Islands. This decrease in land mass is swallowing islands whole and devastating many coastal households in the region, forcing inward migration to more central areas or complete migration out of the region. In a study done through the Business Insider, the drastic loss of land was explained. They measured the size of 27 atolls over a period of decades and found that while 14% had shrunk, a couple had disappeared completely. This continuation of land loss will eventually cause the entire culture of the Pacific Islands to be driven out, and the islands will be washed away completely.
This is a photo of Kiribati, a low-lying island in the Pacific Ocean. The sea levels are rising at a rapid pace here, but a more pressing issue is more complex, and it will eventually force the inhabitants to flee. Due to climate change, the tides have become extremely high, And since plants are grown on the shore of the island, the salt from the ocean water kills the plants. Additionally, most drinking water has been contaminated from the salt soaking into the ground.
This is a population pyramid of the Pacific island Tuvalu. Tuvalu has a much smaller 20 to 40 age group than expected due to a brain drain. Many people who can afford to have moved to Fiji, New Zealand, or Australia to receive a better education and more pay. Additionally, fish are a major part of the Tuvalu diet. Due to coral reef bleaching, fish are now consuming a toxin that is poisonous for humans, and when eaten, it causes ciguatera poisoning. Ciguatera poisoning is becoming increasingly common, and it now accounts for 10% of illnesses there. This image of Beniamina Island, a part of the Solomon Islands, shows the dangerous effects of the rise in sea levels on this island region. A once thriving island is being swallowed by the currents of the Pacific Ocean, whilst houses are being swept away. This image shows the crowding and loss of land the inhabitants experience and will soon be forced to migrate off of their homeland to a new place. An account from a young resident in a New York Times article explains that this is not his island of origin. They were forced out of his first home after the tides of rising sea levels swept it away. The author describes this small piece of land and how it has changed. Quote, "The spit of earth he currently occupies here in this remote stretch of the South Pacific is half the size it was when he arrived 5 years ago. At mid-tide, it is 24 steps across at its widest point, and 58 steps long, by the author's own account." End quote. This account shows the rapid loss of land over a short period of time and the ongoing effects and losses that these residents will face. This population graph is displaying the population of Polynesia in relativity to a timeline which runs from 1950 to 2100, showing the expectations of the population of this country in the Pacific Islands through the next 80 or so years. As you can see, the population has grown since 1950 at a steady pace. However, this graph shows an expected plateau around 2040 and will begin to decrease in population moving forward from there. An obvious piece of evidence into this drop in population in Polynesia is the forced migration of its residents due to the forces of climate change. These include many of those which we have already discussed, such as rising sea levels, loss of landmass, intoxication of produce and food supply, and destruction from natural disasters. All these factors are ones that will support the decrease in population in Polynesia, as well as the forced migration out of this region.
To conclude, our research has proven that eventually these places in the Pacific Island region will disappear if we do not act fast.
Although, in most places, the migration has not actually started, there will be a great increase in outward migration in most of these islands.
So far, climate change has had a devastating effect on the well-being and their food supply.
The economy has also suffered, which has caused a premature exodus on a few locations already.
Due to rising sea levels, large amounts of displacement and inward migrations have taken place. Eventually, these islands will disappear and residents will be forced out.
This is a call to action for everyone. Our everyday habits, which may seem harmless, have extreme consequences globally. Even though you may not feel the direct effects of climate change, it is devastating many people like those of the Pacific Islands and around the world.
Do your part to slow climate change and help those who desperately need it. Thank you for listening.